Okay, good evening, everybody. It's Wednesday night, so it's Halacha and Tanya. We're in the middle of the dinam of the midas that a person's supposed to, basically morals and ethics. The last thing we learned last week was you're not allowed to hate anybody. You have to love every single person. You're not allowed to hate anybody. If they do something bad to you, you should ask them, like, why are you doing it? Maybe they have a reason. Maybe they have an explanation. Maybe they don't even realize they're doing something bad to you. So the best thing is you have to admonish them, talk to them, try to work things out. Okay, the next thing over here is as follows. What happened? There's a mitzvah in the Torah that's called halachic. You have a biblical obligation to admonish. Halachic means admonish, which is a double expression, which means even 100 times. You have an obligation to admonish your friend. Now that means like this. But the prerequisite for that is, the Torah says, this is a very important din in this whole aspect of admonishing somebody. Okay. The Torah, the beginning of the same pasuk, it doesn't start off the sentence, the Torah is saying, admonish your friend. The Torah says like this: you're not allowed to hate your neighbor in your heart. Then it says you have an halachic obligation to admonish your friend, which means as follows: the prerequisite in order to admonish somebody for the bad that they're doing, you need actually to first love them, and once you love them, then you have a right to admonish them. Now, the admonishment has to be done in private, not publicly. You can't embarrass them publicly. You have to tell them nicely, softly, properly, and tell them, listen, I mean it for your good. Maybe you're unaware of it. Maybe, but that's basically if you know the person's going to listen to you. If you know he's not going to listen to you, that many times the halacha is you really shouldn't tell them, because then now they're knowing that it's forbidden. That's worse than if they didn't know that you're not allowed to do it. So there is a concept in halacha, very positive, the mitzvah of admonishment. The prerequisite for admonishing somebody else is actually the concept of loving, not hating them, really loving them. And as we learn many times, especially when the Baal Shem Tov said that, a fault you see in somebody else is really a fault in yourself. Now, to understand this in very simple terms that we learned before. You love the kid, you just want them you're doing it because you really want them to be good. You want them to be good. So then you're admonishing them in a positive way. You really want them to become better. And that's the only way you have a right to admonish somebody else, is not because you hate them and you see, I got you. The admonishment has to be done in a way that you love the person, you're upset with what they do, and therefore you're really admonishing them in a way that they really should become better. So, and again, it has to be done in private. Now, if there's a desecration of Hashem's name, if there's going to be a desecration of Hashem's name, then you have to do it even in public. Whenever there's a desecration of Hashem's name, the Gemara says, the Rambam rules like that, the Shulchan Aruch says it, B'makom sheyesh chilul Hashem, in a place where there's a desecration of God's name, you don't give respect even to a Rab, even to a teacher, a Rebbe. Whenever there's Chilul Hashem, the desecration of God's name, and we'll learn about that a little bit later, what the definition of desecration of Hashem's name. A person has to do everything in their utmost abilities to make sure there's no desecration of Hashem's name. Then you have an obligation to admonish them even in public. Okay? The next thing is like this. You're not allowed to embarrass somebody in words or action, and definitely not in public. The Gemara says, if somebody embarrasses somebody publicly, they have no share in the world to come. That's what the Gemara says. In addition to that, the Gemara says it's better and rather for a person to throw themselves into a burning fire, not to embarrass somebody publicly. It's worth to kill yourself, throw yourself into a fire and get burnt in order not to embarrass somebody publicly. Where do we learn this out from? So we learn it out from a pasuk in Chumash, from the story of Yehuda and Tamar. You know, Tamar dressed up like a prostitute and Yehuda was with her. And even though before Matan Torah it wasn't forbidden any way whatsoever, but on Yehuda's level, it wasn't a great thing. And then he found out that she was pregnant. Okay, he didn't know it was from her, from him. She got pregnant. So he said, take her out and burn her. She was a granddaughter of Shem. She was a Bas Kohen, committed adultery. She has to be burnt. What happened? She didn't tell him when she was being taken out to be burnt. Okay, now first he gave her collateral. He gave her a signet ring. He gave her a few things, yeah? Like this says in the Chumash. So Tamar didn't say to Yehuda, hey, boy, chick, I'm pregnant from you. You're the one, you're the guilty party here. What she said is, I'm pregnant to the one who owns this walking staff and the signet ring. That's the one I'm pregnant from. Yehuda could have just kept quiet. She could have been burnt. Tamar was willing to be thrown and get burnt, not to embarrass Yehuda publicly. She could have said, hey, I'm pregnant from you, but she would have embarrassed him. She was willing, and therefore the Gemara learns out a halacha. It's better, it's preferable to throw yourself into a burning fire and get killed rather than embarrass somebody publicly. And it's a very interesting, when the Gemara quotes this din, Taisus asks a very interesting question. We know there's three things that you have to give up your life for: idolatry, adultery, and murder. But seemingly this is a fourth thing. The Gemara says it's preferable to be thrown into a burning fire rather than, that means it's preferable to die and not to embarrass somebody. So why isn't that a fourth thing that you have to give up your life for? Taisus answers it's not clearly in the Chumash. We derive it. It doesn't exactly mean necessarily like that. But it shows the severity of embarrassing somebody publicly. Now, a person has to be very careful, extremely careful, because we see the severity of embarrassing somebody publicly. And whether it's a young person, an old person, you can't say, oh, he's a little kid anyway, big deal. And you can't call them a nickname that they're embarrassed from. Now, let's say somebody's fat and you call, hey, fatty. Okay, it's not a nice name. And it says even giving a nickname to somebody, even if they're accustomed to the nickname, they're accustomed to the nickname. Nevertheless, you're not allowed to call somebody with a nickname. Unless if they want you to call them that nickname. But otherwise, it's forbidden. And you're not allowed to say something in front of a person that will cause them embarrassment. And it's by the way, it's a very, very strict din about embarrassing somebody publicly. Now, there are certain cases when it's allowed. Let's say if it's in heavenly things, like we said before, it's going to be a chil Hashem, and you already told him off privately, and he's still doing it, and it's a desecration of Hashem's name, and you already discussed it with them privately, and it didn't help. Then halacha says, but you have to be very careful with this. Then halacha says you're allowed to even embarrass him publicly, embarrass him, insult him until he becomes great. Like we find the prophets did that throughout Jewish history. They would scream at the Jewish people publicly. And that was allowed because they tried doing it in private first and it didn't help. But when it's something between man to man, between people, so then you're not allowed to ever embarrass somebody publicly. There is other cases that a teacher and a student, the teacher was telling the student, not to do certain things, and they told him to him in private, and the student still didn't listen. So then halachically he'd be allowed to embarrass him publicly. But you have to be very, very careful because, like we said, it's a very delicate issue in halacha, and it's a very severe sin. Now, again, if it's an open avera, a person openly desecrating, Judaism in a way that, so then you have a right to embarrass them even publicly, because people shouldn't think that it's allowed to do what he did. And again, it's called the desecration of Hashem's name and so on. Along these lines, the din is like this. If somebody did something to you, so he said you're supposed to ask him why you did it, and you're supposed to talk to him about it and forgive him. The best thing halacha says is, what happens, I don't want to talk to him about it, but I want to forgive him. And you really, in your heart, you forgive him, and you don't hate him anymore. That's midas chassidus, because then you're not even talking to the person to bring it up again, just to forgive him. But in human nature is very funny. You get into a fight with somebody or disagreement. Let's call it disagreement, and they ask forgiveness, and you forgive them. Okay. What's interesting, 40 years later, the guy does something bad to you, all of a sudden you bring up what happened 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago. But that means you never forgave them. If you forgave them, then it should be off the records. It doesn't exist anymore. But this is human nature. Even then, we don't forgive. Even when we say I forgive, the Gemara says, and we discussed this last time, the Gemara says, even, God forbid, somebody cuts off your hand, you should forgive them, because Hashem wanted it to happen. And again, like I said last time, if you forgive somebody else, then Hashem forgives us. That's the way it works. The bottom line of these dinim, you have to love everybody. You're not allowed to hate anybody. If you see something doing something wrong, you have to admonish him in a nice, quiet way. Not that they should become embarrassed. Not that they should, in a way that they really seriously want to change their ways and they want to become better. And that's the proper way of doing this type of admonishment. Okay, next thing is like this. You have to be extremely careful with widows and orphans, because the Torah says many times, if they cry out to me, Hashem says, I'm gonna listen to them, because they're people by nature are down and out. Now, what is the definition of an orphan? You can have a 90-year-old orphan too. I mean, they're an orphan, but an orphan by definition that the Torah says you have to treat differently than everybody else is an orphan as once they're able to stand on their own feet, they're able to get married, run a business, then they don't have a din of an orphan anymore. Or when they're younger and they're not able to stand on their own feet, they have to rely on other people's guidance and all that, then they have a din of an orphan, and you have to be extremely careful with them. You're not allowed to, you have to speak to them nicely, you have to speak to them respectfully, because they're very low-spirited, even if they have a lot of money. And in fact, the din is, even the widow and orphans of the king, you can imagine, they're definitely well taken care of. They still, you have to warn them, because the Torah says, Kol almana v'yosem leisanu, any widow, any orphan. That means even wealthy, kingly, whatever. You have to, because any time Hashem says, I have a deal with them, whenever they cry to me, I hear it. But that's when you're doing it for yourself. But what happens, let's say a teacher or a craftsman is teaching them a trade, and you want to teach him Torah, or you want to teach him a trade, or just that they should be proper, good human beings. So then if you're admonishing them and yelling and screaming at them for their benefit, that they should learn Torah, they should be able to learn how to run a business, or they should have proper guidance, then yes, you're allowed to. But even then, you should try to be more delicate than you would with another person. And like you said, what is considered an orphan, as long as he's not able to do his own things like all the other adults, then he still has the din of an orphan. Otherwise, he's not an orphan. The next din is a very interesting din. You're not allowed to do something that people will suspect you that you might be doing something wrong. The source of this is, by the way, the Gemara says that, in the Bais Din, they had massive tzedakah boxes, for the sacrifices, for donations to the Bais Din. They were very big. And every so often, the Kohanim would go into that room to empty it out. I mean, you have to leave room for more money coming in. So they would empty out the pushkas, as we call them. So the din was, they were not allowed to walk in to that room with a garment that had pockets. The Gemara says that they were not allowed to walk into a room with a garment. Why? People will say, he's probably putting some money in his pockets. You know what I mean? He's probably ripping off some money from the Bais Din. It goes even more. What happens if you're collecting tzedakah for somebody, and you meet somebody in the street, and he says, "Oh, you know something? I owe you $10. Here, let me pay it." He tells to the tzedakah collector, says, by the way, I owe you $10 or something. You're allowed to take the money, but you're not allowed to put it into your own pocket. Because people see you're collecting for tzedakah, they see this guy giving you money, they don't know that's debt that he owed you the money. So what do you have to do? Halacha says, you have to put it together with the tzedakah money. Then when you come home, you can take back the money that it's owed for you. But while you do, you're not allowed to do anything that people will suspect you of doing something wrong. Even though you're not. Even though halacha, you're not doing anything. You're not doing anything wrong, okay? But you can't do it because people will assume that you're doing something wrong. The Gemara says there was one of the rabbis of the Gemara, was Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Cheskel. A great sage, he was a student of Rav and Shmuel. Second generation of the Gemara. He was the Rav of a city. And in his city, the butcher did not give meat on credit. COD. You bought meat, you have to pay cash. Rav Yehuda was the Rav. Okay, there was no question that the butcher would have given him the meat on credit. But Rav Yehuda said, if I would go into the butcher and take meat without paying for it, meaning on credit, it would be a desecration of Hashem's name. Because if this guy doesn't take credit from anybody, and all of a sudden I'm walking out without paying him, what are they going to think? I'm stealing it. Even though he wasn't. The guy would definitely give it to him as on credit. But anything that a person does that could be misconstrued of something which is wrong, or people think it's wrong, then it's forbidden to do it. And there's a lot of things in life, in daily things, that we have to be extremely careful, even though we're not technically doing anything wrong, but it might look like we're doing something wrong. So then you have to be very careful not to do it. Why? We say this in benching because there's a pasuk in Chumash that says, "V'yisem nikiyim mehashem u'miyisrael." The pasuk says in Chumash, you should be clean from God and from the Jews. So what does that mean? You should be clean. You're not allowed to do anything that people will think you're doing something wrong. And then there's another pasuk we say in benching, you should find favor and good intellect in the eyes of God and people. So from here we learn out that you're not allowed to do anything whatsoever that people will think, God forbid, that you're doing something wrong. It is part of all these morals and ethics. Last din of this chapter, even though it continues with the other din we're going to learn, it says, Asher Yagever, Asher Yiftach B'Hashem. Fortunate is the one who believes in God. There's another pasuk that says, Seinei Matonis Yichya. In Mishlei, Shlomo Melech says, Seinei Matonis, one who hates taking gifts, Yichya will live long. Okay, so generally speaking, even though today it's customary you give gifts, but there's a concept of people not wanting to take gifts from other people. They trusted in Hashem, even though that person might be the vehicle that Hashem is giving you the money. But it says, but to believe in Hashem, that Hashem is going to give us what we're lacking. And again, that is not something, by the way, the poskim right, the codifier is right, this is not something that you could say for somebody else. Well, it's interesting, whenever anybody brought a sefer to the Rebbe, the big dollars, the Rebbe would always tell him you have to pay for it. He would give him $1. It wasn't the full price of the book, obviously, but he paid for it. Many times when people bought the Rebbe gifts, personal gifts, they're not saying like the Mishnayos by heart or Sfarim for his library, this collected just for the community. But the Rebbe would demand paying for it. Okay, I'm not saying people today do accept gifts and this is the normal routine. But you should know, in Midas Chassidus, to go above and beyond the letter of the law, people should try to avoid taking gifts. Okay, the next thing over here in Kitzur, the next chapter goes what's called Rechilus, which is gossip, Lashon Hara, everybody knows what Lashon Hara is, Nekima, revenge, and the Tira is also a type of revenge. Okay, these are all things that are biblically forbidden. The Torah says, "Leiselech rachil ba'amecha," you should not be a gossiper. The Torah speaks, you're not allowed to speak Lashon Hara. The Torah says you're not allowed to take revenge, and you're not allowed to do netira, which we'll learn when we get to the detail, the difference between revenge and netira. Okay, now, literally, Rachil, Reish Chof Yud Lamed in Hebrew means a peddler. That's literally what it means. The term, why is a gossiper called a peddler? What does a peddler do? They go to the big marketplace, they go to the wholesale market, they buy up goods, and then they come back to their home and they unload it, retail. Okay, that's basically. So what is a peddler conceptually? You load up goods in one place, and then you unload them in a different place. What does a gossiper do? He hears information, yanta stories, in one place, and then he goes, unloads it to everybody else. Now, what is it? It says, he loads up, he says, this is what this guy said, this is what I heard about this guy. And he says like this, in halacha. Even if it's not a lie, it's true. It's not even bad. It's not even bad. What you're saying is true and it's not good. I mean, it's no good news. There's nothing bad about it. It's biblically forbidden, okay? And there's a whole story in Tanakh that because somebody did the Rechilas, a whole city of people were killed because of gossip. It was true. It wasn't negative. A whole city was killed out because somebody was speaking gossip. And therefore, right afterwards, right when it says, you should not be a gossiper. Again, now Lashon Hara is when it's true, but it's bad. Rechilus, gossip, is forbidden, even if it's not bad, and it's not forbidden, and it's not derogatory, and it's true, you're not allowed to be a yanta, a gossiper. And right after that, the Torah says, don't stand idle when your friend's blood is being shed. Remember, last day we were discussing that there's no biblical, in civil law, there's no legal, maybe moral, but there's no legal obligation that if somebody's drowning to help him. I could walk right by and they cannot charge me criminally for not helping them. Maybe morally I did something wrong. But in Torah, you have a biblical obligation. If you can help them, go help them. Right after the mitzvah of not being gossiping, the Torah says, because eventually it's possible that you can actually kill the person because of gossip, like that story took place in Tanakh. And he said, what's the story? There's a guy, he told Shaul HaMelech that Achimelech gave David food and a sword. Okay, now one time in history, Shaul HaMelech was out to kill David because he maintained David HaMelech because of his friendship with Yehonatan, his son, wanted to overthrow Shaul, which wasn't true. So Shaul HaMelech was running after David HaMelech to kill him as a rebellious person against the king. Doeg said to Shaul that this guy Achimelech fed David HaMelech when he was running away. Okay? It wasn't negative about Achimelech. It was nothing good. And Shaul, and if Shaul would have asked Achimelech himself, did you give David HaMelech food? He would have said yes. Nevertheless, a lot of Kohanim in the city of Noiv were killed because this guy, Doeg gossiped truth to Shaul HaMelech, nothing negative, but he gossiped. Because of that, Shaul HaMelech killed that whole city of Kohanim. So therefore, we see you have to be very, very careful in not being a yenta, not going gossiping. We'll just start the next thing, which is even worse than that, and that's Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara is when you speak bad about somebody, it's true, but it's bad, negative. That's even if what you're telling them is true. If you're lying about somebody, then it's called motzi shemra. Motzi shemra means you're bringing out a bad name on somebody. It's not even true. So in other words, like this, rechilus gossip is just gossiping. It's not bad. It's not lashon hara. You're not embarrassing anybody. It's just gossip. Lashon hara is when you speak bad about somebody, but it's true. You're not making up stories. What you said is 100% true. Motzi shemra is even worse because then you're speaking bad about a person, things that are not even true. You said the person did this and this and this, and it's not even true. They didn't do it. So then it's even it's worse. Okay, we'll go to Tanya.